All right, so yesterday I asked you guys to start to look at the details. We looked at experimental data as to what producers need. We looked at that 6-part experiment, and I asked you to come up with what you think plants had to take in to make their own food. Now, you may have already heard several people ask me the process for that, the nerdy scientific name. I'm sure you've probably heard of it. When they make their own food in the form of sugars, is called photosynthesis. Big nerdy name. It would go on our wall, but remember, if you divide a nerdy word in half, photo means light and synthesis means to make. So they're actually going to make something using light. Pretty simple. And I think you know from your gizmos that if you don't give a plant light, it's really not going to grow. So just real quickly to look at that, if we put that into words, you should have seen yesterday that if you give a plant light, which we saw in our experiment, both virtually and in yesterday's data, and they are able to get carbon dioxide and water together, they can make sugars. So in this visual over here, I had to use this one because it includes some consumers. Both these guys can eat plant parts, but notice the sunlight is going into this plant. I'm not sure what kind of plant it is. It gets water from its roots, and it gets CO2, carbon dioxide, it takes in from the air. At this point, probably important to pause and think, where the heck would it be getting its CO2 in the air from? Remember, animals like us, the mice, the deer, breathe out carbon dioxide. So we had to think back to some of our chemistry. Carbon dioxide, remember, chemical reactions really is what we're going to see. We can take the parts and join them. Because remember, the chemical formula for carbon dioxide, CO2, has a carbon and an oxygen. Water is H2O. Notice when we make these sugars, here's their chemical formula. We saw some chemistry. We should recognize that. There's some carbons, some hydrogens, and some oxygen. So all we're going to do is combine them together. So again, the process for that, we've got it written in words up here. They take in light and water and CO2, and it's going to make or produce sugars, which is food for them, and gives off, we know plants give off oxygen. And you saw that in the gizmo there. So very, very quickly with that, I want to give you the chance to reflect on this. They make sugars. The form of the sugars, the nerdy word for this is called carbohydrates. And all that is, that's the scientific name for different groups of sugars that they can make. Because what the plants can do, they can take those carbohydrates and they can use them as building materials, like building blocks, almost like Legos, and stick them together to make even bigger carbohydrates like starch and cellulose. And that's what makes up the rigid parts of the plant, like their cell walls, their bark, their leaves. They're all made of starch and cellulose. So really the plant is actually, it's making food for itself, but it's also building itself. Kind of crazy. So notice this last line, that process, if they keep doing that, keep making extra sugars and storing them, building bigger sugars, that's what's increasing the plant's biomass. Um, and remember, like we said before, that the best part about that is all that extra biomass, all those leaves, all those nuts and seeds and fruits and stems and roots in some case, and the sugars inside the plant, that becomes food for other guys that eat them, like the deer and the mouse in our picture. So that's why this biomass, that's why we're focused on this, why it's so important. It's the start of the food chain, start of the food web. So really, like we got to reiterate here. Why do they make sugars and starch? Remember, it can be a form of food. Starches and sugars inside of their bonds, inside of that molecule, that big particle that they built. There's energy stored in there, and when we break apart the energy, that's stored in those bonds, we break those bonds, that releases energy for the organism to use, either the plants or the animals when they eat the sugars. So just really quickly, the nerdy term for that is called cellular respiration. Now, most students don't like that. This aerobic means air. Cellular respiration kind of related to the word breathing. But that's the term for when either the plants or other organisms, when they eat the plants, when they start to break down those sugars and they release that energy. That's where you get your energy from, eating, right? So the process for that is called cellular respiration. Somehow you get those sugars, either you make them or you have to eat them if you're a consumer like a deer or a mouse. And when you start to break down those sugars, it releases energy for you. So in essence, the best part here is that it's actually the opposite of photosynthesis. So if we look at our equation for cellular respiration, we can actually see it's kind of backwards. It's opposite of photosynthesis. You have to take a sugar and you take oxygen, and then they react together and it gives off CO2, which is what we breathe out. The only reason you breathe out carbon dioxide is because your body is breaking down foods, sugars. It gives off water, and then it gives off a type of energy, which we don't need to worry about, this ATP. We'll just know that that's energy. So the nice thing is, if we go back and look at this photosynthesis, plants have to take in carbon dioxide and take in water, and they give off sugars. Remember, the sunlight is the energy they take in. But when they break down the sugars, they're using the sugars and the oxygen, and they're giving off carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Not sunlight energy, it's a usable form. So again, they're really the opposite. So that's a really important factor to remember. So now we know a little more of the details, kind of nerdy, but you already actually knew the basics of, we've got to give them carbon dioxide, got to give a plant light, got to give it water, and it will produce. And now we know a little bit more that what they're producing actually are these sugars, and then we saw from the gizmo they're giving off oxygen. Pretty simple aspect. And remember that they can store them, and it's a beautiful system. So remember, without producers, there'd be no plants, but without producers, there'd be no other organisms either, because that's the start of the energy flow. That's where all the food begins. All right, so now I'm going to ask you, I'm going to stop there, ask you to respond to a friend. A friend makes a statement on our exit ticket about an oak tree. A couple of friends, actually. I'm going to ask you, just as your exit ticket, really simple, to think about this and respond to it.